In the scorching desert sun, a group of boys are toiling away, digging holes in the sand. One boy, overcome by the heat and exhaustion, makes a terrible decision. He takes off his shoes and approaches a nearby rattlesnake, only to be bitten. This unfortunate event serves as a grim reminder of the harsh reality at this place. Meanwhile, in the city, Stanley Yelnats 4 is walking down the street when a pair of shoes falls from the sky and knocks him down. Stanley's father, an inventor working on a cure for smelly feet, sees this as a potential source of research material and decides to take the shoes home. Unfortunately, this seemingly harmless act takes a turn for the worse. The police suddenly surround Stanley, accusing him of stealing the shoes. It turns out these were no ordinary shoes. They belonged to a famous baseball player and were stolen from a charity event. The police take Stanley to his parents' apartment, where things don't look good for him. His father's apartment is overflowing with shoes, and Stanley's room is decorated with posters of the baseball star. With these incriminating details, Stanley is taken to court. Faced with the choice of jail or spending 18 months at Camp Green Lake, a strange-sounding juvenile detention facility, Stanley chooses the latter. On the bus ride to the camp, Stanley can't help but wonder if this unfortunate turn of events is part of a family curse. The vast desert landscape stretches out before him, dotted with countless holes. He even has a fleeting mirage of a merchant and his mule. Finally, they arrive at a small, shady town where boys in prison uniforms walk around freely. Stanley meets Mr. Sir, the assistant warden, whose name he finds strangely amusing. Stanley tries to explain the origin of his unusual last name, Yelnats, Stanley spelled backward, a family tradition for generations. However, Mr. Sir shows little interest and quickly lays down the rules of the camp. Since there's nothing but endless desert for miles on end, with no water source in sight, there's no need for watchtowers or fences. Escape simply isn't an option. Stanley is given 2 sets of clothes and a shovel, his primary tool for the grueling task ahead, digging holes. Every day, he has to dig a hole 5 feet deep, meticulously measure it with his shovel, and be mindful of the dangers lurking around him, rattlesnakes and yellow-spotted lizards that could be deadly. Next, Stanley meets Dr. Pendanski, the camp counselor. He gives Stanley a quick tour and emphasizes the most important rule: don't upset the warden. Dr. Pendanski then asks the other boys to show Stanley his sleeping quarters. Stanley is shocked to find vomit stains on his bunk, a grim reminder of the previous occupant. The doctor uses the boys' real names, but they all have nicknames they use among themselves. The youngest boy, who never speaks, is simply called Zero. Stanley, eager to fit in, makes the mistake of addressing one of the boys by his real name, only to be shoved around as a reminder to use nicknames. Stanley grabs his dinner, a plate piled high with different types of beans, nothing fancy. Then, a skinny boy named X-Ray snatches some of Stanley's food. X-Ray claims he deserves more because Stanley didn't dig a hole that day. Curious, the other boys ask Stanley why he's at this camp. When Stanley says he stole famous shoes, a quiet boy named Zero surprises everyone by asking if the shoes had stars on them. Stanley confirms it, and a memory flashes back to the trial. The baseball star, the owner of the stolen shoes, spoke about growing up in an orphanage and why he donated them to charity. He called Stanley a fake fan, making Stanley feel even worse. Later that night, Stanley can't sleep. He remembers his grandfather's stories about a family curse. Apparently, that's why Stanley's dad can't seem to make any of his inventions successful. Even Stanley's great-great-grandfather wasn't lucky. He made a fortune in the stock market, but was then robbed and stranded in the desert by a notorious criminal called Kissing Kate. She got that nickname because she'd kiss her victims after killing them, leaving bright lipstick marks. But with Stanley's great-great-grandfather, she just took his treasure and left him for dead. The next morning, before it's even light, the boys are woken up to start working again. They each get a tortilla for breakfast and a shovel. But when Stanley reaches for a shovel, X-Ray shoves him and grabs it instead. It turns out X-Ray has a shorter, special shovel that he won't let anyone else use. At the digging site, Mr. Sir, the assistant warden, tells Stanley a strange rule. If he finds anything interesting while digging, he has to report it. If the warden likes it, Stanley gets the day off. Mr. Sir claims they aren't actually digging for anything specific, though it's just to build character. The boys all get to work digging holes, and sometimes when they throw dirt, it accidentally falls into other holes. Stanley tries to ask them to be careful, but they just laugh at him. As Stanley digs his own hole, he can't help but think about the curse again. His mind wanders to a story about his ancestor, Ilya. Ilya worked on a pig farm and fell in love with the boss's daughter, Myra. He wanted to win her heart, so he visited a fortune teller named Madame Zeroni. But instead of advice on love, Zeroni told Ilya to forget about Myra and travel to America. Ilya wouldn't give up, though. He asked the boss for Myra's hand in marriage. Unfortunately, another guy offered a huge pig as a dowry, and Ilya lost. Dejected, Ilya went back to Zeroni. This time, she took pity on him and taught him a trick to win Myra's heart. He had to take a baby pig up a mountain every day to drink from a stream, all while singing a song to it. The idea was that Ilya would get stronger carrying the pig, and the pig would grow bigger to be a valuable dowry. Once he gave the pig to the boss in exchange for Myra, Ilya had one more task. He had to carry Madame Zeroni up the same mountain so she could drink from the stream too. If he failed, a curse would fall on him and all his descendants. Stanley followed the plan for a few days, feeding and singing to the piglet until it grew enormous. He proudly presented the pig to Myra's dad, but there was a problem. The boss's own pig was exactly the same size. Myra couldn't decide who to marry, so she flippantly suggested a silly guessing game. Stanley, furious at her childishness, decided to follow Madame Zeroni's original advice and head for America. But in his haste, he completely forgot to take Zeroni up the mountain. As promised, the fortune teller cursed Stanley's family for his carelessness. Back in the present, Mr. Sir cruises by the digging holes in his truck, letting the boys refill their water canteens. Stanley, covered in blisters from the rough work, gets teased by Mr. Sir for being a newbie. Zero, a surprisingly fast digger, finishes his hole first. The other boys joke that he must be eating the sand. Finally, Stanley finishes his hole too, but nobody offers to help him climb out. He has to figure it out on his own. Back in the town, Stanley witnesses Mr. Sir shooting a yellow-spotted lizard with a gun. The shot misses, and the lizard lunges at Stanley. Thankfully, Mr. Sir takes another shot and saves Stanley from the nasty creature. Days turn into weeks, and Stanley settles into a boring routine at the camp. Early mornings, gross bean meals, endless digging with more blisters forming, dodging dangerous animals, and sometimes even having to deal with broken showers. The other boys don't make things easier, constantly picking on him for being a softy. To avoid trouble, Stanley keeps to himself and lies through his teeth in letters to his mom, claiming a fantastic time at a regular summer camp. One afternoon, Stanley digs up a strange fossil and excitedly shows it to Dr. Pendansky. But the doctor bursts his bubble. The warden doesn't care about fossils. He also reveals a surprising fact. This area used to have a lake. The land belonged to the warden's grandfather. This sparks a memory in Stanley's head, a flashback to a time when the town was full of life. A traveling merchant named Sam would visit in his cart pulled by a mule. He sold amazing onions, boasting they could cure any illness and even keep those deadly lizards away. Sam had a soft spot for the local teacher, Catherine. He'd always bring her a special bag of onions, and in return, she'd give him a jar of peaches she'd picked. All the men in town were jealous of Sam's attention from Catherine. One rainy day, the school roof leaked so badly that Catherine had to send the kids home. Kind-hearted Sam volunteered to fix it, just to spend more time with Catherine. He even started fixing other parts of the school. However, he had to witness the evening adult class throwing inappropriate comments at her. The warden's grandfather, Walker, asked her out, but she turned him down, leaving him furious. Eventually, the school became the most beautiful building in town. One rainy afternoon, Sam and Catherine finally gathered enough courage to kiss, unaware they were seen by Walker, who immediately spread the news around town. In just a few hours, the townsmen came together and burned down the school as punishment. Catherine rushed to ask the sheriff for help, but he was drunk and asked her for a kiss. As Catherine pushed him away, the sheriff mocked her, reminding her that interracial relationships are illegal and Sam would be executed. Horrified, Catherine ran to warn Sam, but it was too late. The townsman shot him while he was on his boat. Sometime later, Catherine came back and shot the sheriff before giving him the kiss he wanted. Then she left town and became the outlaw known as Kissing Kate. Back to the present, X-Ray approaches Stanley and tells him that the next time he finds anything, he should bring it to him. Later in town, Stanley accidentally falls on one of his tormentors and almost gets in a fight. The boys immediately calm them down, but now Stanley has earned their respect. He is nicknamed Caveman and even gets a better spot in the waterline. Sometime later, Stanley gets a letter from his mother telling him his father's experiment keeps failing and the landlord may kick them out soon. Zero notices Stanley is ready and admits he never learned, so he asks Stanley to teach him. However, Stanley refuses, saying he isn't a good teacher and that he's too tired at the end of the day, needing his rest. During another digging session, Stanley is surprised to discover a little object with the initials KB. The boys wonder if it's a shotgun shell, but it seems too thin. X-Ray takes the object, ignoring Stanley trying to stand up for himself. As soon as Pendanski sees it, he contacts the boss, who immediately comes over, and the boys are shocked to discover the warden is a beautiful woman. She's very pleased with this discovery, so she tells X-Ray to take the day off and instructs the others to completely excavate the area around X-Ray's hole. That afternoon, the boys work much more than usual, but they don't find anything because it's the wrong spot. For the next few days, the boys have to keep on digging in the same tunnel they've created, yet the only thing they find is a small dial. Soon the warden gives up, and the boys go back to digging individual holes. The next day, while Mr. Sir is filling their canteens, one of the boys steals a bag of sunflower seeds from the truck. After Sir leaves, the boys begin sharing them, but unfortunately, Mr. Sir quickly notices the bag is missing and turns the truck around. The boys scramble to hide the seeds, but they accidentally spill some right at Stanley's feet. He tries to be a good friend and hides the seeds with sand. When Mr. Sir returns, he sees the evidence and nobody fesses up. Stanley, in a surprising move, takes the blame for everything. Shocked, everyone watches as Mr. Sir drags Stanley off to the warden's office for punishment. Inside the office, Stanley sees posters about kissing Kate everywhere. The warden even shows off some special nail polish she makes with rattlesnake venom. After a quick paint job on her nails, the warden gives Mr. Sir a smack for interrupting Stanley's work over something silly like seeds. Back at the digging site, the guys see Stanley as a hero. Zero even finished his hole. To show his thanks, Stanley agrees to teach Zero how to read. The next time they see Mr. Sir, he has 2 nasty scars left by the warden's poisonous nails. He's so mad at Stanley that he forgets to fill his water canteen. This reminds Stanley of the little tube he found. Maybe it's kissing Kate's lipstick. Remembering more about Kate, Stanley realizes she only targeted people involved in Sam's death and the school burning. But she did like to steal things. After taking Stanley the first treasure chest, she buried it where the lake used to be. While Kate was resting, she was found by the warden's grumpy grandpa, Walker, and his wife. Their town was ruined after the lake dried up on the day Sam died, and they were desperate for money. Instead of killing Walker and his wife, Kate got a sweeter revenge. She let a lizard bite her and took the secret location of the chest to her grave. This way, Walker and his descendants, like the warden, would spend forever digging in the vast desert. Back in the present, Stanley starts teaching Zero how to read and write. We learn Zero's real name is Hector Zeroni, a relative of Madame Zeroni. Because Zero is such a fast digger, he helps Stanley with his hole, making the other boys jealous. One day, a bully starts picking on Stanley again for having help. Dr. Pendanski, surprisingly, encourages them to settle things with a fist fight. The fight doesn't go well for Stanley, but Zero jumps in to help and almost hurts the bully badly. Dr. Pendanski fires a gun in the air to break up the fight, and the warden rushes over to see what happened. The boys tell her Zero was helping Stanley, but Stanley explains he was teaching Zero how to read. The warden gets really mad, and Dr. Pendanski keeps calling Zero names and saying he's dumb. Zero gets so angry, he hits Dr. Pendanski with a shovel and runs away into the desert. Mr. Sir wants to chase him, but the warden tells him not to bother. Since Zero has no family, they can just erase his records and pretend he never existed. That night, the boys talk about how Zero will likely die lost and alone in the desert. Stanley can't stop worrying. He remembers the story of his great-great-grandfather, Stanley the First, who survived 16 days in the desert after kissing Kate stole his stuff. Apparently, he found shelter in a place called God's Thumb, but nobody knows what it is, and Stanley the First couldn't explain because he was half crazy when they found him. The next day, a new boy arrives to replace Zero, which makes Stanley sad. He hatches a daring plan. When Mr. Sir comes to fill their water canteens, Stanley steals the truck. Mr. Sir jumps on the running truck to try and stop him, so Stanley tries to push him off. In the struggle, Stanley loses control and the truck crashes into a hole. Deciding to keep going, Stanley jumps out and runs into the desert, with the other boys cheering him on for his escape. The warden, furious about the stolen truck, orders Mr. Sir to report Stanley missing in 2 weeks, figuring there won't be a trace of him left by then. Under the blazing sun, Stanley walks for a long time, ignoring the dangerous lizards around him. Finally, he stumbles upon Sam's old boat and finds Zero hiding underneath, exhausted but alive. Zero survived by eating jars of peaches that Kate had given Sam years ago. The peaches had turned into jam. After sharing some of the jam, Stanley spots a mountain in the distance that looks like a thumb. He realizes that's where his ancestor must have gone. They leave the boat and start climbing the mountain, which is really tough. Stanley slips and almost falls, but Zero uses his shovel to save him. Unfortunately, Zero hurts his hands in the process. Stanley bandages them as best he can, but Zero gets weaker and eventually collapses. Stanley catches him before he rolls down the mountain, but Zero is too tired and faints. Determined to save his friend, Stanley carries Zero all the way to the top of the mountain, just like his ancestor carried the pig. At the top, Stanley sees a patch of green and discovers a hidden stream with water and, amazingly, Sam's delicious onions. He wakes Zero up, and they both eat and drink to recover. Stanley even sings a song his family loves, not realizing it's the same song his ancestor sang to the pig. With this good deed, Madame Zeroni's curse on the family can finally be lifted. Back home, Stanley III finally invents a cure for foot odor by mixing peaches and onions, and the family celebrates. The next morning, Zero makes a shocking confession. He was the one who stole the famous shoes. He saw them at a donation bin for the homeless shelter and didn't know they were important. When the police came looking for him, he threw the shoes off a bridge, accidentally landing them on Stanley. Zero got caught stealing shoes again the next day, this time from a store. Stanley isn't mad at Zero, though. He actually sees this as fate bringing them together, and he's glad it all happened. Meanwhile, Stanley's lawyer arrives at the camp to take him home because they figured out he's innocent. The warden tries to stop her, but the lawyer promises to return with more people to help get Stanley out. Stanley and Zero are feeling much better after their adventure. They return to the digging area and find the hole where Stanley discovered the lipstick. After digging for a while, they finally unearth the famous chest. They're so excited. But their celebration is short-lived. The warden and Mr. Sir appear, but just then, a swarm of lizards surrounds them all, including the chest. The warden, not exactly a nice person, decides to let the lizards do their dirty work. She even tells a story about how tough her childhood was. Morning arrives, and the lizards are still just hanging out, not harming anyone. Suddenly, the lawyer shows up with some police officers. The warden tries to lie and say the boys stole the chest from her office, but Zero outsmarts her by pointing out Stanley's name on it. Case closed. They head back to town, and the lawyer puts the chest in her car, ready to leave. But Stanley won't go without Zero. The lawyer asks for Zero's file, but it's mysteriously missing. The police investigate and discover a shocking truth. Mr. Sir is a criminal and Pendansky isn't even a real doctor. They all get arrested, along with the warden. To celebrate this turn of events, it starts raining for the first time in years, a miracle. A few days later, Stanley and Zero, along with Stanley's family, open the chest. It's full of treasure, even stocks for a big company. Everyone agrees to share the wealth with Zero. The first thing Zero does is hire people to find his mom, and they have a tearful reunion. The camp gets shut down, and the boys finally get real help. Stanley and Zero's families become neighbors in a swanky area, and their friends from camp visit all the time. Stanley's invention becomes a huge hit, and guess who stars in the commercials? The famous baseball player. It seems like everything was connected all along,